Welcome to the South Asian Studies Colloquium. On behalf of the South Asian Studies Council, I'd like to welcome Professor Mytheli Sreenivas for joining us for this event. My name is Rohit Day. I'm the Chair for South Asian Studies for this academic year and an Associate Professor in the Department of History. Professor Sreenivas is an Associate Professor of History and in the Department of Women and Gender Studies at Ohio State University. She is a historian of modern South Asia, with focusing on women's and gender history, the history of sexuality and the family, and looking at the cultural and political economy of reproduction. Her first book, Wives, Widows, and Concubines, The Conjugal Familial Ideal in Colonial India, aimed to place the family at the heart of early 20th century history and show how questions on the emotional life of families, whom to marry, whom to love, whom to care for, were shaped by shifting economic, political, and social relations during the last decades of colonial rule. She shows through her work how the idea of a new familial ideal was central to both modernity and nation building, not just for India, but more specifically to the Tamil-speaking region in South India. The book was foundational in our understanding of the relationship between family, political economy, and politics, and was awarded the Joseph Elder Prize in Indian Social Sciences from the American Institute of Indian Studies. The current book on which she's speaking on today is titled Reproductive Politics in the Making of Modern India, and it asks how biological reproduction becomes central to reproducing India as a modern nation state. And one of the exciting things about the book is that it spans a period that starts in the late colonial period, but goes right up till the 1960s and 70s. It offers, in some ways, a longer history of population control than exists in current imagination, and shows how the question of reproduction first becomes a public question in response to colonial era crisis, and then becomes central to feminist, nationalist, and modernizing projects from the late 19th century onwards. We'll be running this colloquium as a book panel, and after Professor Sreenivas's opening remarks, we'll have responses from two of our doctoral students in history, and I'll briefly introduce them. Gaurav Krishnanandi is a doctoral candidate in the history of science and medicine, and his research focuses on histories of public health, health policy, and post-colonial governance in 20th century South Asia. His current dissertation explores practices and discourses of public health in the city of Calcutta from the 1940s around the Bengal famine through the first decades of partition and independence, exploring how existing regional and historically contextual norms of class, morality, and citizenship shaped emerging policies around health and hygiene in the city. And it looks at the kind of tussle between urban municipal governance attempts to manage public health and the ways in which it's negotiated and resisted by people who inhabit the city. Our second discussant, Alexander Williams, is a joint JD PhD candidate in the Department of History at Yale, working on 19th and 20th century South Asia, particularly histories of legal print culture and the legal profession. He's written on a number of topics, including the Indian National Army trials and its role in international criminal law, and the kind of emergence of a post-colonial legal profession in modern India. So with that, I'd like to invite Mytheli to tell us a little bit about the project itself, what drew her to it, and the sort of challenges of writing this sort of history. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks very much to the South Asian Studies Council, and especially to Rohit for the invitation to speak. And thanks as well to Alexander and Gaurav for taking the time to engage with the book and sharing your comments. So I'm also really grateful to be back virtually at Yale, my undergraduate alma mater, and the place where I first became interested in South Asia academically. While at Yale in the 1990s, I was among a group of undergrads who hoped to push the university to direct more curricular attention to South Asia. And so I'm really, truly gratified to be back here in such a vibrant South Asian studies community. So thank you for having me. I'll start with a land acknowledgement. All of these events are virtual, but they're always taking place in material spaces. And I'm joining you today from my office at The Ohio State University, which occupies the ancestral and contemporary territory of the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandot, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples. As an employee of Ohio State, I want to honor the resiliency of these tribal nations and recognize the historical contexts that have and continue to affect the indigenous peoples of this land. So as Rohit said, I was asked to talk briefly about how I came to write Reproductive Politics in the Making of Modern India, to discuss some of the book's main findings as well. So broadly speaking, if I'm going to be 100% honest, the book has its roots in how I experienced and learned about India as the child of Indian immigrant parents. Overpopulation, in scare quotes, was my family's answer to nearly every question that I asked when visiting India during my childhood summers, from why the buses were more crowded than what I was used to why poverty seemed so visible to me, a child of the American suburbs. In short, overpopulation was the go-to explanation for why India was the way it was, but it was simultaneously an explanation that suggested inevitability. How else could India be, given its population size? Revisiting these childhood memories as a historian, I began to wonder about the history of this hegemonic idea that had been my explanation for India for so long. And I started reading some work in population history, just a couple of examples, Sumit Guha on health and population in South Asia, Mohan Rao on neo-Malthusianism and Indian population control, Alison Bashford and Matthew Connolly on the history of world population as a concept and as a transnational movement. And of course, Betsy Hartman's feminist critique of population control policy. So from here, it was a short step to recognizing, as others obviously have before me, that population was always also a reproductive question. So human numbers are about how many children are born, how many die, and all the social, cultural, corporeal, and gendered practices that are associated with these births and deaths. So population, in short, is a reproductive justice issue. And this is where some of the ideas of the book connected also with my own activist concerns and interests. So indeed, much of the foundational feminist work on women's and gender history in colonial India has engaged with reproductive questions, though they're not always named as such. So there is, of course, the historiography of birth control, most notably the books by Sanjay Maliwalia and Sarah Hodges, but there's also a much wider range of research that examines reproductive politics, the controversies around child marriage and widow remarriage, the scandal around Mayo's Mother India, the reform of Hindu laws of marriage and inheritance and family property. So this was sort of the conceptual space from which I began to write the book, right? A question about the hegemonic idea of overpopulation, a recognition that the history of population must also be a history of reproductive politics, and a connection between this work and the broader field of South Asian women's and gender history. So my goal was to write a history of modern India that puts reproduction at the center and sort of see what happens when one does that. So I think that many of the core questions that we ask about 19th and 20th century history that often remain as if distinct from the histories of sexuality and reproduction are actually deeply implicated in them. So whether that's about colonial rule and anti-colonial thought, about inequality and caste and class hierarchy, about economic development, about decolonization, all of these, right, I think are deeply entangled with this reproductive politics that I want to investigate in the book. So with that goal in mind, I'll highlight 4 interventions that I see the book making. In brief, they're about the question of chronology for a modern history of reproductive politics that Rohit also alluded to. Second, the centrality of India to ostensibly global change. Third, the place of feminist activism in population control programs that were effectively anti-women. And finally, the intersection of histories of heterosexuality and affect with economy and development. So my first point is perhaps the sort of obvious one, which is that we need our histories to have longer time horizons, right? Many historians say this. We tend to see population and reproductive politics as mid-20th century concerns. They seem to arise from transnational population control networks and the national developmental estate. But I argue in the book that reproduction as a modern political question was first asked and answered in the process of imperial consolidation in the late 19th century. And so its roots are part of the political and economic systems of empire. And so I focus in the book on the nexus of two developments, the first modern census counts, and then also widespread famine. And together, I think these serve to quantify population in new ways, beginning in the 1870s, and simultaneously help to entrench Malthusian ideas in India. And this moment marked the beginning of a sustained discussion that suggests that Indian poverty and starvation were due to overpopulation, and that this overpopulation was in turn due to uneconomic reproductive practices. And so this emergence of overpopulation as an explanation for Indian poverty sort of developed at a time from the 1870s to the 1920s when Indian population was not in fact increasing. In fact, the fear of overpopulation did not explain any empirical fact on the ground. And so this pushed me when I was writing the book to ask how and why this idea nevertheless, right, despite its sort of disconnect from empirical realities, nevertheless became so believable, so widespread, and so convincing to so many people. And so we find that a Malthusian explanation for Indian overpopulation took root alongside the material and ideological conditions created when the Indian colony became part of global systems, right? Systems of food and finance and of agrarian production and capitalist markets that were ushered in by the British Empire. And so when population finally did begin to increase beginning in the 1920s and first became visible by the 1930s, the resulting reproductive politics followed a well-worn terrain that had first developed in the 1870s. So this brings me to my second point about the book's findings, which concern the place of India in the global history of reproductive politics. Histories of population and reproduction, even those that take a transnational approach, have tended to center the West. I think that's going to be no surprise to the audience here. The result is that the rest, right, even if understood to be important, effectively become sort of local sites where global forces are enacted. And within such analyses, India as a space becomes a preeminent site for global population control measures, or at most a site of collaboration between Indian and Western elites. But in working on this book, I wanted to tell a sort of a different story, and I began to see something different. That is, India was not simply a local place where global reproductive politics happened. Instead, I argue that historical conditions in India are what prompted a reproductive politics with global aspirations to take shape. This was true, for instance, in the late 19th century, when Indian famine conditions energized a neo-Malthusian birth control movement across the British Empire. Or in the 1920s and 1930s, when eugenic claims about caste and race shaped a transnational politics around contraception, migration, and a global color line. It was equally true in the mid-20th century when a conference in Bombay that opens my book prompted the creation of the International Planned Parenthood Federation. And the organization's founders, who included Dhanvanti Ramarao and Margaret Sanger, aimed to take a transnational birth control movement in more explicitly Indian directions, which for them meant a focus on population control as the rationale for contraception. There are lots of other examples, but in short, I'm interested in how Indian conditions help to define the meaning and purposes of reproductive control transnationally. The result was a modern reproductive politics that claimed to address poverty without tackling inequality, and consequently made reproduction into a particular kind of economic question. And that's the politics which underpins population control and economic development policies, both in India and beyond. So that brings me to the third point of intervention, which is that the history of reproductive politics is, of course, deeply implicated in and implicates histories of feminism. Many scholars and activists have made clear that the history of birth control was not a simple trajectory from subjection to freedom in any part of the world. Instead, advocacy about contraception, abortion, and maternal and child health sprang from a variety of motivations, for instance, neo-Malthusianism and eugenics, sexual radicalism and anti-patriarchal thought, anti-capitalism and socialism, and casteism and anti-caste politics. Historians have shown us that feminist activists contributed to all of these streams of thought about reproductive control. So there's no direct line connecting feminist contraceptive advocacy to a progressive politics. My book aims to build on this understanding to show that organized Indian feminists, who are often overlooked in the history of state-led development, actually played a pivotal role in putting family planning on the state's agenda during the first post-colonial decades. And they did so by making it an essential form of economic development to be conducted by middle-class women for subaltern women, right? It became sort of the space of women's development. Recognizing this makes visible a certain kind of paradox. How is it that avowedly feminist activists helped pave the way for state-led population control programs that would ultimately disregard the reproductive health and autonomy of women, especially of Dalit, Adivasi, and Muslim women, who are already the most marginalized? And I can say more about this in the Q&A, but that's sort of one of the thorny questions that I spent a lot of time trying to work through on the book. But for now, I'll conclude with a final point of intervention that concerns affect, economy, and histories of sexuality. To do that, I'm just going to share my screen here. I did this and I realized that I can't go to my second slide. Sorry about that. Let me see here. Okay. Let's try it this way. Okay, no. So I'm going to only share the one slide, and then maybe I can try to figure out how to share some of the others later. I have another one there. But what I will say is that the last chapter of the book looks at images of the small and happy heterosexual family as these images proliferated across public culture from about the 1920s to the 1970s. And this is my attempt to investigate the sexual politics of India's family planning regime, and more broadly, to ask about the co-constitution of histories of heterosexuality and economic development. So this is, I put a couple on 2 slides, but I'll just show this first slide. So these are some of the images I look at to identify a politics that mobilized heterosexuality to naturalize certain modes of planning, certain orientations toward time, specifically about times of day, but also the present and the future and appropriate future aspirations, structures of sexual intimacy, structures of economic rationality, and visions of future consumption. So again, if I can get those slides to work later, I'm happy to talk about more of these images, but for now, I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sreenivas. I just wanted to also alert everyone, Professor Sreenivas's book is published by UW, University of Washington Press, but is also available open access. And there is a better priced edition for South Asia that's coming out from Women Unlimited Press later this year. I'd like to invite Gaurav Nandi to make his remarks.
Thank you, Professor Day. And thank you, Professor Sreenivas, for giving us the opportunity to engage with your book. Given that I'm currently working on my own chapters in sort of history of public health, public health policy during the first 10 years after independence in India, I was sort of honored to engage with the book, both in terms of overlaps of themes and interests that I found on my own dissertation, as well as sort of the interventions that you've made in postcolonial historiography in South Asia. I also read the book in terms of how historians of postcolonial South Asia can reflect on global historical events as shaped by conversations that are ongoing in the global South, thus contradicting, I think, sort of repeating your point, I suppose, but thus contradicting histories that place South Asia within the politics and hegemony of the global North, or looks at the global South as anomalies separate from the narratives, narrative shaping events that are centered in the global North. And I also found it particularly powerful to understand the history of what is essentially an early post-colonial democracy by centering approaches of feminist histories and the histories of the body to show how the latter powerfully shaped discourses of both the post-colonial body politic and individual bodies of primarily women and men. Having said that, I'll keep my comments to two main parts. Firstly, I'll just highlight some of the key arguments that were made in the book, especially within the histories of biopolitics and how I saw it intervening in historiography, not only in South Asia, but also in the histories of medicine and public health. And secondly, I'll just point to some questions that came to my mind while reading the book, both about the craft of writing history and what are we as historians to make of some of the changes over time that you mentioned in the book. And these are some of the questions that have confounded me in my own research, and I'd sort of love to hear your thoughts on them if we happen to have the time. So just to begin, firstly, this book, as Professor Sreenivas already mentioned, tells the long history of the complex entanglement of the question of reproduction and economy, how within the context of the famines in colonial India, during the second half of the 19th century, colonial officials and policymakers searched for an explanation as to the vulnerability of the rural Indian population. These officials did not, however, begin their search with an search for an answer with a blank slate. Rather, they were already indoctrinated in the Malthusian relationship between population and the economy, where continuing increase in population led to the reduction of food supply, thereby causing civilizational catastrophes. This, as the book shows, has a stunningly and surprisingly long and enduring life through the 20th and into the current century, where bodies of particular citizens and subjects are transformed into objects of state policy. In the case of India, it's often sort of women who belong to who are in the urban poor or rural communities. Therefore, when colonial officials sought an explanation of famines, the specter of overpopulation was created, which was then utilized by several Indian reformers and nationalists of the time for their own diverse goals. And notwithstanding the fact that, as Professor Sreenivas just mentioned, that India's population actually was stagnant during many of the decades during the late 19th century, public discourse established the fact of overpopulation in India. And here the book shows how eugenic anxieties seem to drive the public discourse on, quote, the fitness of the Indian race, unquote, linking individual Indian bodies to the fate of the nation. And the book shows that both the ideological right and the left bought into the narrative of eugenic thought. And I suppose I've been curious regarding this point as to the extent to which Malthusian thought was diffused in an Indian context, or were there existing anxieties within elite classes about, say, the urban poor, Dalits and Muslims before the late 19th century in India that carried over into the 20th century. In other words, was there a longer history that shaped a quote braided public discourse? And I borrow this concept from Projit Mukherjee on eugenic fitness within the South Asian context. And over the decades that the book covers, overpopulation and the focus on reproduction, as in the object of state and social control through which one could achieve the goal of restraining population growth, became a sort of political topography, which while being polyvalent in nature would eventually result in the, as we know, in the state persecution of poor Indians during the emergency. This polyvalence of the economization of reproduction, as Professor Sreenivas calls it, has been one of my key takeaways from the book. And as a political topography that centered the relationship between women's bodies and the development of the state, this was a space occupied by a diverse range of stakeholders with diverse and sometimes opposing and contradictory objectives, as was mentioned before. However, during the post-colonial period, national development eventually became the dominant justification. And we see continuous but faint voices that provide us with alternative imaginations. And to that end, I read this book in terms of its engagement with class politics in post-colonial India, where social service became a way in which middle-class literate women contributed to nation building. And it reiterated, again, this relationship between the middle classes and the urban poor or the rural villagers as unidirectional, with the urban poor or the rural villager and their moral and behavioral habits being the object of reform. And personally, I've come across similar dominance in public discourse in the slums of Calcutta, for instance, in the 1950s, where the minds and bodies of people were projected as new objects of reform in order to create a civic consciousness. And so the middle classes not only continued to put a blanket of moral degeneration on the spaces, lives, and minds of poor Indians, state-controlled education and propaganda also became a panacea of development. And we see alternative imaginations in this book as well in the birth control movement, especially during the transition period right after independence, where instead of Malthusian anxieties driving the discourse, women from diverse backgrounds ranging from Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay to the self-reflect movement who used this topography for anti-patriarchal and anti-caste politics. And to that extent, we also see sort of first-hand voices whenever possible of women from rural India and the discourse of family planning. I thought it was very powerful to hear from these women as historical actors, as they spoke about rationalities behind their decisions and what made them choose certain decisions, while reflecting at the same time on the broader context, which is that rather than the promises of development, they were living within the failures of development that had failed to redistribute land and resources. And here I would like to hear your thoughts on how historians can think about alternative imaginations that are limited in archives, but we still get to see in the book some small glimpses. And I would also love to invite you to speak on what your goal was as you were narrating these voices. Like, to that instant, were there other roles that these voices played in previous iterations of the book? It would be really great to hear some of your decision-making processes about how you place these voices of, say, oral history or ethnography within historical scholarship. And if time permits, I would get to a couple of my questions. And firstly, it seems that I was very interested in this this consistent urge in post-colonial policymakers to make India a laboratory for global experiment. And there has been a number of works on how the colonial government would often turn their colonies into spaces where they could conduct scientific experiments and this contribute to legitimacy of the regime to both the colonies and the metropole. But I was curious as to what you make of the consistent opening up of India as a country and bodies of Indians, primarily again poor Indian women, to global scientific regimes. I mean, off the cuff, I'm unwilling to just say that this was just a naive belief in modernization or the universalization of science, or as science is benign, where women's bodies were being turned into sites of modernization. But do you see this as another manifestation of the differential values of life, that those whose bodies were being made accessible by the state were already bodies that were already valued less in the dominant state narrative? Have you found opposition from policymakers to this import of invasive technologies between this period of 50s to the 70s? So I'm just wondering, could there be a more complicated reading of this? And lastly, this book, I think, will also be of interest to contemporary social scientists as it speaks to climate activists, for instance. It sort of shows how in the contemporary discourse of climate change, institutions of global north are once again looking at population control as a more efficient, quote unquote, option for addressing climate change, and that the Malthusian calculus still seems to carry weight. And that seems to be an eerie similarity between the 19th century focus on overpopulation while averting the official gaze from exploitative colonial economy as the cause of famine, and the contemporary call of family planning as a solution to climate change, while shifting our gaze from the root causes of capitalism, the interactions of capitalism and environmental degradation. And perhaps I'll end with this, which is a broader question of how best we could tie historical events with this long alive to the present, especially now given the current political landscape in contemporary South Asia, and perhaps the more recently the new draconian population measures, which sort of anti-Muslim population measures that are being talked about in Uttar Pradesh. I would love to sort of hear your thoughts. And yeah, I'd love to, lastly, I'd just like to thank you, Professor Sreenivas, for joining us today, and for Professor Day for giving me the opportunity to engage deeply with this book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gaurav. So I'd like to invite Alex.
Hi. Yeah, so first off, I would just like to thank Professor Sreenivas for joining us, and also to Gaurav and Professor Day for their comments. The book is a really major contribution, not just to sort of modern South Asian history and histories of reproduction, but also to histories of sexuality, political economy, and even material and print culture. So I'll first try to kind of lay out what I saw as the book's most striking historiographical contributions on my read. And I think that Professor Sreenivas has already sort of addressed a lot of those, so I'll try to be brief on those. And then I'll sort of limit my comments to two sets of questions. The first about kind of the book's use of the archive and especially the kind of visual archive that we get in chapter 5. And the second set of questions sort of linking the book to my own field of study, which is legal history. And I'll try to kind of tease out the book's connection to legislative reforms surrounding family planning, particularly in the post-colonial era. Right. So although the contributions of this book are not limited to these observations, I found three areas of intervention particularly striking. First off, I think that there have been a number of kind of global intellectual and global institutional histories of population control in the last decade or so that have really sort of tried to reorient the conversation away from reproduction and to say that this is about kind of geopolitics or food or migration. And I think that that's important, and Professor Sreenivas doesn't discount that, but also I think points out that it's not so much an either or as the fact that kind of the sort of political economy of population was always sort of co-constituted in relation to reproductive politics. The book shows that kind of the economy was defined in the first instance by an exclusion of reproductive labor, and then reproduction was kind of reintroduced as a lever that had economic consequences. Secondly, as Professor Sreenivas said, I think this is like really the first history to do justice to the centrality of India to global thinking on population reproduction, not just as a kind of source of anxiety for the Population Council or the Ford Foundation, but actually a space where kind of relationships between reproduction and political economy and normative sexuality were worked out. And I think there's also a kind of reorientation of the actors who are involved. I think a lot of these sort of big institutional histories and intellectual histories focus on technocrats and demographers. And I think the book really makes a contribution by focusing on the work of feminists and activists. Thirdly, I think the book really also speaks to the sort of intertwined histories of sexuality, domesticity, and political economy within South Asia. The book draws on Ritu Birla's work on the centrality of the family to the making of the modern economic subject in colonial India. And I think Professor Sreenivas really extends this analysis to the history of development in India, showing how the kind of normatively heterosexual small family was thought of in economic terms, and contraception was seen as a means for sort of rational economic behavior. And I think also it really speaks to recent work on gendered sexuality in colonial India, such as Durba Mitra's Indian Sex Life, which recently came out. And in that book, Mitra argues that sort of deviant female sexuality as portrayed or embodied in the kind of the figure of the prostitute was central to late colonial sociological thought in India. And sort of deviance was characterized as kind of anything outside the bounds of upper caste Hindu marriage. And I think we really see echoes of that here, especially in the 5th chapter, where sort of heterosexual, implicitly Hindu marriage is portrayed as economically rational and consonant with national development, where sort of anything outside of that is portrayed as at odds with an imagined national future. So with that said, I have kind of two broad sets of questions that I'd sort of like to pose. So first, I'd like to talk a bit more about the book's approach to the archive, which I think is one of the things that marks it out from previous histories in the field. And unlike the sort of recent global intellectual histories, which have largely taken into account the approaches of technocrats and demographers, there are, I think, moments in this book where Professor Sreenivas really reads against the grain to find dissenters. And I think that's really significant. So for example, in chapter 4, she discusses accounts that are kind of found between the lines in volunteers' reports in which women were questioning the economic rationality of the small family and arguing that actually having more children was the really rational economic choice, because children were like very important to support their parents in old age. And so, but I found that one of the more kind of striking archival aspects of the book is this rich collection of visual sources in chapter 5. One of these sources is on the cover of the book, which shows a paradigmatic small family with a boy and a girl, a wife seated on the ground with her husband reading didactically from a book. And throughout the 5th chapter, we get a kind of range of other materials, advertisements for contraceptives, cartoons, pamphlets, billboards, that kind of paint a picture of this normative heterosexual small family. And as Sreenivas argues, representations such as these were key mechanisms for the post-colonial state to articulate the connection between economic rationality, heterosexuality, and a small family norm. So I was hoping to just kind of talk a bit more about these sources and sort of how did they circulate? How did you encounter them archivally? And who were their sort of anticipated audiences? I think that there is sometimes this sort of presumed shift from a kind of pedagogical mode of family planning in the 1950s and the 1960s to a kind of more overtly coercive mode in the 1970s during the emergency. And I think the book like generally challenges that distinction, that there is a sort of momentous shift to coercive politics in the 1970s. But I was sort of wondering about how the kind of visual materials, which are sort of like inherently kind of pedagogical and paternalistic, fit into that dynamic. So secondly, I think the book also speaks to debates about the relationship between population, reproductive health, and law. Something that I've encountered in writing on sort of legislative measures to promote birth control or restrict family size in India is the notion of legal imposters or policy camouflage. And the idea here is that like many of the legislative measures in the 1960s and the 1970s, which were ostensibly pitched as being concerned with child and maternal welfare. So for example, the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act in the early 70s, which liberalized abortion, or the Child Marriage Restraint Amendment Act in 1978, were actually sort of not so thinly veiled attempts to legislate population control. And I think that the book helps us see that it's not quite as simple as this framing, and that it's not so much that sort of reproductive health and reproductive politics were a cover-up story for population control, but that they have sort of like long been deeply imbricated in one another. And as she shows, feminists were very much involved in articulating maternal health and women's reproduction as an issue of development and political economy. So one of Professor Sreenivas's most striking moves is to trouble the narrative that is particularly heard in the United States, that there is this kind of teleological shift towards reproductive freedom and reproductive rights over the course of the 20th century. And I think part of that reframing entailed an kind of intentional displacing of abortion as the sort of central object of analysis. But I was also wondering if maybe you could speak a bit more to the way that your arguments in this book kind of intersect with those processes, especially like in the 1970s. And I think that there are some things in the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act in the 70s that really intersect with your arguments in chapter 5. I'm thinking particularly about a clause that sort of allows, or that determines that sort of the failure of contraceptives within a marriage is a valid reason to seek an abortion, but not otherwise. And so in closing and more broadly, I found that law sort of has this shadowy presence in all histories of population reproduction, and in this book as well. So for instance, Mahadev Govindranade, the author of an article titled Overpopulation and Marriage Customs that Professor Sreenivas discusses in the first chapter, was a lawyer and judge, and his article sort of addresses the Hindu law and custom of marriage. And we see how marriage, the marriage age sort of becomes this question that's raised over and over again from the late 19th century through the 1970s and today. I would be curious to generally hear more about how you see kind of law and the legal archive as potentially fitting in to your narrative. And it really struck me in the book that sort of many of the concerns of the actors in this book would overlap with people who are concerned about sort of religious law and custom generally in the 20th century. And I was curious if sort of any of these debates intersected with the debates around sort of the nature of Hindu personal law, the Hindu Code Bill in the 1950s, or Muslim personal law reform in the 80s, or anything like that. Yeah, I'd just like to thank you once again for being here to discuss the book with us.
Thank you, Alex. So we're going to turn to the Q&A part of the section, and I can see some people have already started posting your questions in the question format. Or if you want me to call on you, please feel free to use the raise hand function. I want to perhaps begin with inviting Mytheli to respond to any of the concerns raised by Alex. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much to you both. It's like such a gift to have someone really engage with one's work. So I really, really do appreciate this really careful reading. There's a lot of questions here, so I'm probably not going to address all of them right now, but I'll maybe try to work some of them in to the Q&A. Yeah, I think maybe one that came up from both Alex and Gaurav's questions was really around the archive and the use of the archive in different ways. So maybe I'll start there a little bit. So I think, yeah, I mean, on the question of like a lot of the work around global population history, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like it is sort of seen as a technocratic exercise, and it's not that it's not. I mean, it very much is. And one of the sort of pushbacks I had to sort of earlier versions and drafts was, you know, where are the technocrats, right? Are you suggesting that, you know, feminists sort of created this? And I am, and I'm not, you know. I think what I looked at women's writing and at feminist activism because that's how I've always approached the historical work that I do. So I started from there, and then I tried to bring, because the thing about doing sort of, especially post-47 history, is there's weird gaps, and there's also a proliferation of text, right? Anybody who works on the post-47 period is aware of this. Which is that the gaps are, it's difficult to find things in the National Archives, and it's not always clear, you know, which things are sort of set aside and are not available for researchers. On the other hand, there's a tremendous proliferation in print media, in reports. I mean, there's just like, you know, in a way, the post-colonial state far exceeds colonial ambitions in its ability to sort of document all kinds of things, right? With the rise of social science and demography in particular. So I found like tremendous amounts of technocratic stuff, you know, much of which doesn't appear directly in the book, but is sort of like in my horizon. But I guess my own interests were around thinking through what some of the implications and contradictions were in this push for family planning, right? Because I think that, you know, once the logic becomes sort of established and clarified, then the technocratic stuff finds a home both within the archive and within the logic. And in trying to like figure out how that was put into place, and this is partially why I'm really interested in the 40s and 50s, is to sort of think about how that happens. And that's where I saw some of the feminist writing actually being really central. And I'll sort of stand by that, despite the folks who are like, no, it can't be true, it must be demographers. I don't think it's only demographers, right? It's like, who's pushing these demographers to ask these questions in this way? Who's making it actionable policy as opposed to, you know, a scholarly publication? I think that's where I was interested. So that's part of it. But of course, once you start looking at those kind of texts, it became really important to me, as Alex pointed out, about finding dissenters, because I grew uncomfortable with the narrative that I was telling, right? In other words, we know from lots of different angles, that this was not simply sort of swallowed and accepted by all people at all times. And so, but I couldn't find an adequate archival record of that on its own. And I'm not going to go into sort of all the ways in which archives are constructed, but so I instead sort of tried to sort of think about how these disruptions emerge within the family planner's own narration of family planning. And once I started putting those together, it sort of seemed a place to sort of make a set of interventions, right? That even the family planner is not able to tell a seamless story of family planning, and why not? Which brings me to the last bit about the archive, which is Gaurav asked this, I thought, really interesting and perceptive question around the oral history work and sort of alternative imaginaries that aren't in the archive. And here I'll share a story, which is that I started by looking at the oral history as like my antidote to the archive. I think probably many of us do this. It's an oversimplified version, until somebody, it was actually Srimati Basu who said to me when I presented an early version of this, like, what's that, like, why would you assume that the sort of the real people, the people on the ground, are going to be telling a different story than the very powerful propaganda that they've been hearing for decades, right? So why is it that we look so hard for these voices only as alternatives? And once, she sort of shared that critique with me, it kind of opened up a lot of space to think about how is it that these are different voices, even when they are somewhat aligned with the Malthusian certainties that I'm questioning throughout the book, right? And yet they are different stories that, as Gaurav pointed out, have to do with sort of the sort of failures of the developmental state, even while they adopt some of the language of family planning. So there's a lot more to say about the visual, but I'm not gonna do that. I guess the last quick thing that I'll say, and maybe I'll come back to some of these other questions later about the law and stuff, which I'd like to get into. But I think the other, just another sort of point that I wanted to raise is about, were these just sort of Malthusian ideas that were diffused, or did they actually, were they sort of predated essentially by other forms of hierarchy and differentiation? And of course, the answer to that is yes, right? And so what I'm interested in is thinking through, how do these Malthusian ideas become convincing, in part, because of these material conditions around famine, but they also become convincing because they seem to offer an explanation for a set of ideas that are deeply held by certain elites. And they now become the way to justify that. So for example, in the interwar period, you have like tons of Brahmin men essentially saying things like, we always knew, right, that lower caste and Dalit reproduction is dysgenic. We just didn't have the word dysgenic to talk about it. And I think that's just sort of one example, right, of how eugenic language and neo-Malthusian language offers a kind of scientific rationality and validity and reasoning. Some of these upper caste men who talk about birth control, talk about India, by which they mean, Brahminical culture, as always having had eugenic principles, right? They rewrite caste as essentially a eugenic practice that enables the improvement of the race. So I think those are the kinds of intersections that I'm interested in, right? That it takes, and eugenics takes different form in different places. In the text that I was looking at, this is where it is. So I can say a lot more, but I'll pause if we want to open up to other questions, Rohit.
Thanks. So I'm going to just call on Arushi. Arushi, I'm going to enable your mic if you want to just ask your question directly. And could you also please introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Sreenivas. I've just gone through a part of your book yet. I'm still in the process of reading it. I'm a PhD candidate at Graduate Institute. I'm just in my first year. Um, and I'm sort of working on female sterilization and practices of tubectomy in India. And I was interested in knowing because I come from sociology. I don't have a background in history, but I'm sort of in the process of historicizing the whole idea of steadily increasing in uptake of sterilization practices in India, and what could be sort of the lessons or the moments in history I could focus on, which actually throw light upon this current tension of the Indian state being continually obsessed with the idea of population control, even when more globally we are sort of now confronting declining fertility, not only in like in many parts of India as well as like the latest surveys suggest. And then what kind of reproductive futures this paradox holds, and the burden of which will obviously again like fall on women's bodies and women's reproductive health and justice.
Do you want me to go ahead and answer? Yeah, no, thank you. That's a really interesting question, and I think one interesting thing. There's many interesting things about sterilization in the population control regime. I think one of the most interesting about it from a population control perspective, of course, comes from its permanence, right? And how that permanence enables it to function as a kind of technology of population control in a way that other modes of contraception are harder to sort of fit into that framework, right? So I think it's no accident that sterilization becomes increasingly important in India, especially for women, especially after the failure of the IUD campaign, right? The IUD campaign is supposed to be this moment where rather than a permanent fix, they have this long-term medically controlled device, but instead, sterilization, when that fails, sterilization sort of comes to the foreground even more. So I think in terms of sort of thinking historically, I definitely think the 1960s are this really key moment because at the same time, that's when you see mass sterilization camps for men, which of course predate the emergency, right? And I think that permanence, I've been thinking more and more about it, and this is my way of also cycling back to the question about the UP population bill, which also, among other things, so the UP bill offers incentives and disincentives, right, for having a certain size family. But really what it's offering incentives and disincentives for technically is sterilization, right? That one partner within a monogamous marriage, and then there's like a whole long section about what to do about polygamy, right? There's all kinds of like Islamophobic anxieties coming out of that part of the law. But the other part of the law is the proposed bill. A lot of that is about, agreement to sterilization, more than number of children, right? Those are linked, but those are not exactly the same thing. And in the Indian case, because of the history of the emergency, sterilization is rendered gender neutral in the proposed bill, but of course that, as you know, is going to fall, almost entirely on women. So I'm glad you're doing this work, in short, right? Because I think that there is something really important in how women's bodies then sort of really are on the line even more vis-a-vis this sort of sterilization claims. And I think, I wrote the afterword or epilogue to the book, before the UP bill. I mean, the book had come out by the time the UP bill had come out. But what was striking to me in the UP bill was how what I had also seen as a kind of unwillingness to have that kind of blatant population control in the law or in policy. And instead, there was this push towards things like conditional cash transfer programs and stuff like that to sort of incentivize particular behaviors. Here, sort of like the punitive weight of the law is just sort of like straight up in a way that I had wrongly thought was sort of heading out. So there's something there. I think the history of sterilization can also sort of open up some possibilities for thinking there too.
Thank you. Professor Durba Mitra.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hey, Durba, nice to see you.
Hi. I just want to say first, the conversation has been fantastic, and the responses in the discussion of your book I have found immensely generative. So thank you both for those discussions. Professor Sreenivas, I wonder if you might reflect on the way the paradigm of crisis functions to create rapid policy change in the history that you're describing. For example, in your chapter on the population bomb, the language of crisis is so vivid in the book. At the end of the book, you link this history of the economization of life and family planning to the current climate crisis. So how do you think that this history of family planning, of reproductive politics, might help us think about that temporality of crisis, perpetual crisis?
Yeah, thank you. And that allows me to also come back to that question about climate that came up in the other comments as well. I find this really difficult. You know, I wrote a piece in the Washington Post like a couple months ago, like trying to sort of also make these connections, because I think there's some, so first on the question of crisis, right? I mean, what many scholars and many activists have looked at, right, is what does crisis enable? Of the language of like, never let a good crisis go to waste. And in the case of population control, right, it enables all kinds of things and much more, you know, sort of invasive surveillance and interventions in bodies than would have been possible. You know, Laura Briggs makes this really, I think, important argument around this crisis question in her work on birth control in Puerto Rico, where she's like, you know, the research for the birth control pill would have been seen as far too risky if it was just about giving contraception to healthy people. But it was the fear of overpopulation, right, the crisis of the population bomb, that sort of, you know, changes the risk calculus so that now all of a sudden, you know, the quote unquote risk of overpopulation becomes worth, the risk of the pill. And I think that's certainly true in the India case. We see that with the IUDs and all of that. So crisis certainly enables all kinds of things, which of course, you know, Professor Mitra is already aware, but I think what I found as a historian is it was a lot easier for me to say, hey, look, here's this crisis from the past that enabled like all kinds of, you know, terrible negative consequences for people's bodily autonomy. And I find now it harder to say, in part because of course the same narratives around overpopulation are being mobilized around climate crisis. And I firmly believe that, you know, this is not a method towards solving climate crisis, and is a method that also, again, sort of puts people's reproductive autonomy on the line. So I think that is 100% true. And I think that is where the history matters, right? To sort of remind ourselves of what crisis has enabled. On the other hand, I think it's not enough, and this is sort of where I've struggled, to then think about, but of course we are now dealing with a true crisis, right? So what does it take to sort of push aside the parts of the narrative that sort of, sort of falsely build on crisis, but at the same time, think about the actual crisis that exists. And there, that's why I'm glad I'm a historian sometimes and not a policymaker, but this is a real question I had, you know, including in that Washington Post piece that I'm not sure I really answered properly, you know, which is that we certainly have used crisis in all kinds of wrong ways in the past. But how can we use that knowledge to mobilize a better response to crisis today? And there I'm still questioning that piece.
So there are some questions in the queue, but I'm going to jump in as chair and maybe ask the South Asian historian question. And I was hoping you could perhaps talk a little bit about the connections between your earlier work on what happens in South India around the reorganization of marriage and the family, and this current book, which operates at a very different scale of the international and the national. And I bring this up partly because I see some development economists in the audience, and there is this narrative that of South Indian exceptionalism when it comes to gender indicators, this constant refrain of smaller family sizes and more autonomy for the woman. But when we look, and I think chapter 5 is reproductive because on the one hand you have kind of planning at the national scale and activists engaging in a very organized all India way, as sort of Emily Kropsel's recently shown. But you have a kind of vernacular print culture which exists in each region. So I was wondering if there is something, even within, when you're working at the scale of the national and international, is there something distinctive that vernacular materials or regional histories can tell us?
Yeah, that is the South Asian historian question, and one that even having written the book, I'm still pondering. So you're right. I mean, the first book was very much engaged in thinking about Tamil specificity, and I think that I hope that some of what I have in that book was relevant to people working in other parts of India. But the kind of driving intellectual questions were really around, Tamil families, Tamil social reform, caste and professionalization, non-Brahmin movement, and the critique of Brahmin professionalization and how that links to family, right? So this book is not that, because I felt that the story I wanted to tell was not about regional specificity, which brings me to the question of South Indian exceptionalism, and really a lot of that comes from like Kerala exceptionalism. So I can sort of do this, and say I work, I work on Tamil Nadu, but it's not. I mean, it's definitely also a Tamil question, and here I think. I mean, I'll admit that partially my answer is a non-answer, except to say that much of the book throughout, right, wants to think about what is the dissenting narrative and what are the dissenting narratives. And of course, dissenting narratives don't come from nowhere, right? They come from places. So insofar as I was sort of thinking about the Tamil part of this history, it wound up, and I don't know if this is all one could do, but it definitely wound up in sort of my wanting to think more deeply about the places from which certain kinds of dissent emerged. And those dissents, by the way, I mean, also include like the Madras, Malthusian League in the 19th century. So I don't mean just dissent as like progressive thinking, but rather, how do particular material and ideological conditions in Madras presidency and in Tamil Nadu sort of enable certain narratives that in one way or other kind of rub up against these national and international claims. That's why I wrote about self-respect in this book and not just in the first book, because I was interested in, simply calling something eugenicist and neo-Malthusian is just the start of the question, because those mean very different things in these very different contexts, right? And so how does sort of an anti-caste, how does anti-caste thinking in the case of Periyar connect up with eugenics? In really complicated ways. And there's arguably, I don't call it this in the book, but there's an interesting kind of socialist eugenics, I would argue, at play here, right? Which is that, for Periyar, non-Brahmin reproduction should be controlled by non-Brahmins. And that's a labor issue, that's a gender issue. And so I think I think that these spaces for dissent from this sort of transnational and national hegemonic ideas, certainly exists in all places, and I wouldn't call South India exceptional there. But because I know the South Indian history, I felt sort of compelled to at least use South Indian examples to pull out what some of those possibilities for dissent might be.
Thank you. Ritu Ghosh.
Hi. Hi, Professor Sreenivas. Thank you so much. That was really, really, really helped a lot. And I've been reading your book, and it's been very interesting. I'm an anthropology student. I'm a grad student in my 3rd year. And my work actually looks at surrogacy in India, the surrogacy industry, and how the current uncertainty with the legal part of it. And I was just wondering, since you were talking about India's history with population control and family planning, and how that has been, driven by eugenics. I was thinking about that in terms of the surrogacy industry and how it's kind of turned on its head, because while you're trying to control the fertility of certain pockets of the population, you're using exactly that fertility to for elite families and elite people to be able to form their own families and have children. And that's a multi-million-dollar industry, and that has really made a lot of money for the country. And now that the government has come in and decided to kind of criminalize commercial surrogacy and only legitimize altruistic surrogacy, and it's done so in a very paternalistic, patriarchal manner, with some restrictions on who can even access these services, and completely excluding the surrogate mothers from this. So I wanted to know what your thoughts were on all of this. And I know it's a very uncertain legal landscape right now, but yeah, I just wanted to know.
Yeah, thank you. I admit I haven't followed the latest sort of legal maneuvers on surrogacy, which you are clearly, much better aware of than I am. But I guess I would say, sort of two things. One is just to reiterate really the point that you were making, which I think Sharmila Rudrappa makes and a couple of others make around the history of population control, right? This very notion that reproduction is an economic transaction, right? That is understood from the perspective of economic goals and planning, completely sets the stage for commercial surrogacy, both in terms of this kind of economization of reproduction that I'm talking about, but also in rendering certain bodies available, right? That what is the reason or the rationale for this availability? It's marketed or was marketed around the economic benefit to the individual and family, but also, the sort of the economic growth potential for the industry. So I think that's one side of what's going on here, where I think this history is really relevant. I think the second, I think what's interesting though, because I think I certainly wouldn't suggest that it's just a set of continuities, is what does this particular time, so to talk about something as economized is not exactly the same thing as talking about it as marketized. And so I'm interested in the surrogacy question. I'd be interested from I'm sure your research and from the other work on people who are working on surrogacy right now, is what are the implications of this kind of marketization, right? Which is sort of bringing reproduction into certain economic and commercial spaces prior to the criminalization as something that individuals can do to sort of maximize, their possibilities in a neoliberal sense. And then what happens when you take that industry and, instead carve out this category of quote unquote altruistic, of course, a deeply problematic category, but this category of altruistic surrogacy, which is what, right? Which is essentially surrogacy that's supposed to exist outside of the market and presumably outside of an economistic calculus. And I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it is maybe a generative one, right? Is how is that shift occurring?
Thanks. Amna Qayyum.
Hi, Professor Sreenivas. Thank you so much for being here to discuss your book and its interventions with us. I'm a postdoc here at the Jackson Institute at Yale. And while I hope we can continue our conversations on this book after this talk, for now, I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of the feminist intersections with nationalist projects of population control, which you trace so insightfully in the book. And I'm wondering if you could speak about what this does to our understandings and periodizations of Indian feminism, if we choose to name these actors as feminists upholding particular class-based interests, and not, let's say, as women's welfare activists who are grounded in particular genealogies of early post-colonial social welfare.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad to begin a dialogue, with you in this space that I hope that will continue. So there's a lot in your question. I don't think I'm going to answer all of it, but I am. So one of the questions, right, that comes out of the history of 20th century feminism in India, sort of histories of 20th century feminism. And I'm not sure if I'm entirely getting at where you're at, but it's where I'm thinking right now. Is this notion that, there was a feminism, it was connected to Indian nationalism. It maybe sold its soul a little bit too much, to Indian nationalism. And then 1947 happened, and then it all went to hell, right? Essentially, it just fell apart because there was nothing there. There was no there. And I think a lot of folks are pushing back against this narrative, but not necessarily to make the case that feminism was like a revolutionary progressive force in this time period. Certainly not. And of course, the sort of avowed sort of mainstream women's movement don't encompass all of what we might consider sort of feminist activism in India. We have to look at labor movements and, left movements and all of that as well. But I think for me, I on the question of periodization, I want to see this early post-colonial period. And here, I think I'll just sort of join with some of the work that Rohit, of course, has done, and just sort of like making us look at the 1950s, right? As not just sort of as not simply a straightforward outcome of what had happened in the colonial period, nor as exactly, what would happen a couple of decades later, say by the 70s and 1980s in the case of Indian feminism, but actually to look at this period on its own terms a little bit, and to recognize that at this moment, I would argue, right? I mean, you have a feminism, if it was truly committed to nationalism, that was very much committed to the idea of state power. And after 1947, in one way or another, in whatever limited fashion, and with sort of all of the caveats around partition, there is a sort of capture of state power, right? Nationalism has done that. So in a way, it's unsurprising to me that feminists turn directly to the state, right, in the 1950s as the fulfillment of what they have seen as their goals and motivations all along. And so I think the question then for us as historians is not so much why do they turn to the state, but rather when they turn to the state, how do all the things that we've critiqued colonial era feminisms for, its deep implications in, casteist attitudes, its middle class, centeredness, its Hindu-centered orientations in many cases, how do those map onto and sort of co-constitute in certain moments state policy and the shape of the state? So how does the caste and class character of the state in the 1950s, how does that exist in dialogue with the caste and class character of, sort of mainstream Indian feminism in this period? And I think if we ask that, our periodizing looks a little bit different than a lot of what we've seen in the scholarship. I don't know if that fully answers what you were getting at, but hopefully it's a start.
May I jump in this as well? And I also wanted to sort of refer the audience to this wonderful special issue edited by Professor Sreenivas, Uditi Sen, and Anjali Bharadwaj. That's called A Country of Our Own, which sort of opens up what has been described as a kind of silent decades of Indian feminism to look at what many of these sort of reform, welfare, politically minded women were doing. So I was wondering if, there is, and I think implicit Amna's question was, can they be described as feminists, or should we describe them through another category? I was wondering to what extent self-perception is useful. So I was thinking here of Nirmala Banerjee's Whatever Happened to the Dreams of Modernity piece, I think which originated in the 70s, and also some of the figures that you're describing, Rama Rao and etc., are writing memoirs, well after their kind of careers are over. And how do they see their participation when they're writing it at a moment of disenchantment, right? So that they're writing about what they did 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also sort of wondered about that question around, on what basis do we call these folks feminist? But I think the opposite question is equally true, right? What is to be gained by not calling them feminist? And what is the assumption that we're making about what is feminism, right? But I think, can we trouble our assumptions around feminism by sort of tracing its connections and implications within a set of what are often anti-women ideas of various kinds. So I think that's important, and I think for somebody, Rama Rao is really interesting. Avabai Vardia is also really interesting in certain ways, but I think many of these folks, they're writing, yes, at this moment where they've seen certain kinds of failures, but they're also writing at a moment where they've managed to entrench certain visions of gender/feminism within the state bureaucracy and within transnational networks. So I'm not sure that I think we may read it in terms of the 1970s as this moment of disenchantment and questioning, and then emergency, post-emergency, and the kind of questions that come up. But I'm not sure that all of them always do, right? And so I think that the self-perception question is really interesting. Also, I think because of, in the 50s, what it enables. It enables this speaking on behalf of women that is questioned by left movements, but is not questioned in the mainstream and systematically until at least a decade later, right? So I think it's important to sort of stick with this sort of feminism category because of how these women themselves are sort of using that as to sort of create the space for themselves as sort of spokespersons, as mediators between the state and ordinary women, that becomes this sort of, I would argue, and the volume sort of makes that case as well, the edited volume as where feminism finds its place, with vis-a-vis the state in the 1950s.
Thank you so much. Are there any further questions? We've put Mytheli Sreenivas in the spot for almost an hour and a half right now. So if there are no others, then thank you so much for attending. Thank you to Alex, Gaurav, Brian, and Amar for helping make the event possible. And really thank you, Professor Sreenivas, for being generous with your time and also such a generous listener to so many of these comments that came about. The Colloquium meets next week at 4:30, where we'll be discussing Radha Kumar's new book on caste and policing in South India. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I really appreciate the invitation and the fabulous questions. It was really great to be here.